Welcome to the latest episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined via Zoom by Dr. Sy Garte, a biochemist and a leading voice in the science-faith conversation. And today we're going to address the broad question, can God use evolution as a means to create? And specifically, we're going to be talking about Sy Garte's new book, Beyond Evolution. You really don't want to miss this conversation. Well, Sy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us again. I think this might be your fourth time.
Something like that, yeah.
So you're somewhat of a regular, or maybe an irregular regular. But again, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And today we're going to be talking about your new book, Beyond Evolution, and the subtitle is How New Discoveries in the Science of Life Point to God. And I'm developing a section on my library shelf that's devoted to books by Sy Garte. So this is your third book. And by the way, I've got room for a few more books, so you better get busy writing the next book. But maybe, but we're going to spend time, talking about this book, your new book, Beyond Evolution. But maybe just for curious viewers and listeners, what were the first two books that you wrote? And maybe just a quick summary of those books and how people can get a hold of them.
Sure. The first book I wrote, which was published in 2019 by Kriegel, is called The Works of His Hands. And it describes my journey to faith through science initially, but then through the work of the Holy Spirit, and then what happened after that. And it discusses science in general and how it is compatible with religious faith, especially Christian faith, in several chapters, which discuss things like quantum mechanics and biology. And I have a couple of chapters on evolution, what it is not and what it is, which is important. And then I talk about my own journey, as I said. And that book has done quite well. It's been 6 years, but it's still, active in the market. My second book, which was published in 2024, also by Kriegel, is called Science and Faith in Harmony. And that's a series of short, almost devotional type pieces about how science is harmonious with faith. And it covers lots of ground, lots of different sciences, and lots of things that are, people would be interested in seeing how this is true, how this harmony is true. And I also have a chapter in another book called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. This was edited by Dennis Alexander and Alistair McGrath. And I have the first chapter on there in how there are 12 chapters, all written by people who used to be atheists, but because of the new atheist attitudes, began questioning their atheism. And that kind of fits with me. I had already been thinking strongly and about that I was interested in the Christian faith, but when I read Dawkins' God Illusion, that convinced me to become a Christian. And I wasn't alone. It turns out some very good people also have written chapters in that book. So I recommend.
Yeah, so Dawkins became the hoist of his own petard, to quote Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Okay, well, thanks. And by the way, how can people get a hold of these books? Obviously, Amazon.
Yeah, they're all available, certainly on Amazon and other online sellers, and of course in many bookstores, especially those Christian bookstores that you can find. You may have to look for some of them a little, but they're all available everywhere.
Yeah. Good.
Oh, I should say that third book, the one we're going to talk about today, was published by Tyndale House.
Okay.
A new publisher. So.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And you also have a website as well. Maybe you could just, while we're at it, just give people the website.
Sure. It's very simple. It's my name, cygarte.com, one word, cygarte.com. And that has lots of information about me, more than you'd ever want to know, but especially about the books.
Okay, great, great. So I really appreciate you just taking that time uh, to um, to let people know just some of the work that you've done. And again, you are becoming a very important a very important voice. I'm sorry. In the science faith conversation. And so today we're going to be talking about your book, Beyond Evolution. And I thought what would be fun just is to kind of give you a bit of a scenario and have you react to it. To again kind of introduce the conversation. But before I do that, I just want to make sure people understand that you and I actually share quite a bit in common in terms of our views, definitely as brothers in Christ, but also even in terms of the science faith conversation. But we also do have some differences. I hold to old Earth creationism. You embrace a view called evolutionary creation. So we do have some important differences. And I just want to make sure that the viewers and the listeners understand that the point today isn't really to debate, but it's really an opportunity for you to present your perspective and to give the listeners clarity on your viewpoint. And I've found in the past that even when we disagree on something, many times that disagreement is very mild.
Right.
That we actually agree even more than I would necessarily think going into the conversation. But one of the reasons I, like many evangelicals, hold maybe aspects of the evolutionary paradigm at a distance, and express skepticism, isn't so much maybe necessarily scientific deficiencies or even some biblical and theological issues. A lot of times for me, it's philosophical in nature because, I've been around a long time, and even going back to my college days, the mantra that I heard from my biology professors, the mantra that I hear from many who I might call the leading lights of evolutionary theory, insist that evolution is this unguided, undirected process. There's no directionality, there's no purpose, right? There's no end goal in mind, and that it's a process constrained by history, and it's a historically contingent process. That, to use Stephen Jay Gould's metaphor, we rewind the tape of life and let evolution run again. The outcome would be very different. Everything is just a happenstance. And then, the latest book by Telmo Piovani, the Italian biologist, Imperfection, argues that biological systems are inherently flawed. They're imperfections. And so when you look at those kinds of statements that people insist upon, from a scientific perspective, to me, it's very hard to reconcile that kind of a mechanism with the mechanism that God would use to create. So having said that, I would love for you to respond to that, and I think that's going to be a great segue into the point of your book.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right, Fuzz. And and everything that you just said used to be true. Neo-Darwinism, which was, the idea of evolution that we both grew up with, was very materialistic. It allowed Richard Dawkins to make his famous quote that evolution allowed me to be a intellectually fulfilled atheist. Well, that's a kind of implying that evolution gives a strong boon to atheism, which would follow from everything you just said. Your summary of that is exactly right. And I grew up with that too and believed it. Of course, I was an atheist when I was studying all that material, so it didn't bother me. But none of that is true anymore. And by true, I mean scientific truth.
Mhm.
I hold that there is one truth, but we give it two different names. We give it science and we give it the word of Jesus. Now, my belief long term is that eventually there can only be one truth. And those two versions of truth that we get from the Bible and that we get from science will eventually merge. And we have already seen that in physics to some degree.
Mhm.
And I think it's happening now with biology, just starting to happen with biology. It's a very, very exciting time. Let me start with the first thing. Well, not the first thing, but one of the things you said, which was the very famous quote by Stephen Jay Gould, who
Right.
was a very brilliant biologist, but he was wrong. And his error is pointed out clearly by the work of Simon Conway Morris and many others that no, if you wound the clock back and started all over again, you would get something pretty much like what we have because it's not all random, it's not all chance. Um, there are features of all living things that are found throughout the biological world in every different phylogenetic tree. And that wouldn't happen unless there was some reason for that to happen.
Yeah.
It wouldn't happen by chance.
Yeah.
One of the best examples, which everybody uses, is the structure of the eye, of the human eye, and the octopus eye, which are indistinguishable. And I have a figure in the book showing that.
Yeah.
You can't tell, oh, that's the human, that's the octopus. There are tiny, slight differences, but very minor.
Yeah.
And that's crazy because there's no direct evolutionary connection between octopi, which are invertebrates, and humans.
Yeah.
So that puts the lie to the idea that it's all random chance and could change completely. But even more importantly, and this is coming out of straightforward scientific evolutionary theory, which has changed dramatically. And my book is largely about that. Some of this material is very new. It has not hit the public. It has barely made a strong dent in the thinking of scientists. And I think it's time for people to know about this. And we'll get into that in detail, I'm sure. But the main point is that everything you said about, the idea of neo-Darwinism being the only way, and that neo-Darwinism includes all the things you said, neo-Darwinism is dead in the evolutionary theoretical community. It's just nobody takes it seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some people who do, but they're not actively working in the field. So this book is very much a scientific treatise with the purpose of showing how, as the subtitle says, the newest discoveries in biology, in the science of life, are consistent with a God,
Yeah.
with a divine creator.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Simon Conway Morris, because there was that famous debate between Simon Conway Morris and Stephen Jay Gould that happened on this whole issue of convergence and
Right.
directionality in biology versus, historical contingency. And which was somewhat ironic because in many respects in his book, Wonderful Life, where Gould at least popularized that notion of historical contingency, he was celebrating the work that Simon Conway Morris did on the Cambrian explosion. But there was a real irony. But I can, very early on, when even before I started with Reasons to Believe, when I started recognizing that there was this widespread convergence, to me, that was something that didn't fit with the predictions that would flow if indeed the evolutionary paradigm was an unguided, undirected, or based on an unguided, undirected mechanism.
Right.
And so I wrote quite a bit about convergence, arguing, well, this is consistent with, a designer reutilizing the same designs that were highly optimized. And I can remember reading Conway Morris's book, Life Solution, and, in that book, he was suggesting maybe there are these unknown laws, but since I've revisited his ideas when I wrote the book Fit for a Purpose, and I'm beginning to think that maybe they're not these unknown laws, but they're just simply laws of physics that are constraining biological outcomes so that there's only certain outcomes that are possible given the laws of physics. But the irony is these are outcomes that are exactly what is needed to create the diversity of life that we see here on Earth. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I should have said it earlier. I mean, you have really contributed a huge amount to this field. Fit for a Purpose is a fantastic book, and I also should say that the title of my book, Beyond Evolution, it was only after it was in press that I found your book, your fairly short book, right, called Beyond Evolution, and then a different subtitle. So I didn't steal it from you, Buzz. This was the publisher's title, and I didn't realize that you had already had it. But anyway, as long as you're not upset about it, I'm happy.
yeah, not upset about it, even in the least bit. But I think the point here is that if we really are going to be serious about exploring as people that are involved in the science faith conversation, particularly now I'm speaking to people that are in the old earth creationist camp, we really, really need to be open to the possibility that what we're engaging when we think about evolution is going to be very different than
Yeah.
what we have historically engaged. And we need to be open-minded to recognize that there is a strong teleology that undergirds or appears to be undergirding the evolutionary process,
Yes.
which and that teleology is very difficult to mask. It's
right.
extremely evident. And again, I'd love for you to react to this. One of the issues I have with some of my friends who hold to an evolutionary creationist position is this idea that, well, God is at work controlling the process, but is just invisible to us. And that just doesn't fit with what I see in Scripture, where God's glory is revealed in his creation, including living systems. And so why would God operate in a hidden way so that the process is indistinguishable from a materialistic process? But when you talk about the idea that evolution is appearing to be teleological, and it's very difficult to walk away from the nature of the processes that are being explored with any other conclusion, that suddenly is something that really is consistent with God's glory being manifested.
Yes. And that's the basic point of the whole book. And I have to say that, there are evolutionary creationists. I guess I still am in that camp, barely. But what I'd like to do is encourage my friends and colleagues in that camp to listen to what you just said, because the problem we have with evolution, and I think you used the word, I don't remember what word you used, but it's really a dogma. I mean, there's been a dogma in evolutionary theory for a long time. That dogma is now breaking down, as dogmas do in science. Okay, that's the history of science. That's how progress is made. The first thing you have to do is break the dogma, and that's what's happening now. Mm-hmm. And that dogma that everything is simply chance mutations followed by natural selection, and we're done. That's not viable anymore. And there are still people who don't realize it's not viable. And what you said is absolutely true. I think everyone on every position of the science faith continuum, from young earth creation to intelligent design to old earth creation to evolutionary creation, everybody, including myself, have to open our minds and realize that this is science, and science always changes. And it always gets to the truth better by changing. And as I said before, we are getting closer and closer to agreeing with theological truth with every change.
Yeah.
And I think if we can do that, the differences among everybody is going to be less and less. And that, I make a strong case for this approach in the first two chapters of this book, especially related to evolution.
Yeah.
I talk about the fact that it's very ironic and very surprising that if you really look at what different scientists of faith say about evolution, whether they're young Earth creationists or evolutionary creationists, they have a lot in common. I mean, I don't have a lot of figures in the book, but I have a few. And I have one that shows the phylogenetic tree of cats as generally accepted by mainstream biology. And then I have one that's from Answers in Genesis. And it looks exactly the same, except that the starting point is different. Instead of evolving, from the beginning, the evolution starts after the flood. But that it's the same process. And the difference, of course, is whether or not the original beginning of life was a cat kind created by God or a single cell way back. Now, that's a big difference. I'm not downplaying that. But the point is that it's not yes or no evolution. Evolution is definitely happening. And young Earth creationists accept that. They have different views on it, but still, it's evolution of some kind. And so those are the two extreme positions. So if the two extreme positions can agree on that, then old Earth creationism and intelligent design, probably can too.
Yeah.
Now we're never going to come to a final yes. We all agree with everything because that never happens in science. That doesn't happen. It has nothing to do with faith. It's just a factor of science. I've been in the scientific research business for 40 years, and I got to tell you. The number of arguments and yelling and screaming that I've heard about, purely scientific issues is just huge.
Yeah.
So, I'm very optimistic. And I think, again, some of these really new findings, these recent findings, which show that not only is purpose universal in all life, but so is agency. And, which is still hard to get, but now I believe it.
Yeah.
So is cognition.
Yeah.
The ability to sense the environment, to communicate, to remember, to make decisions is found in bacteria. It's found in single cells. And every time I say that, people go, no, that's impossible. Well, it's in the literature, and it's not, and this is not coming from Christian sources. This is in the mainstream biological literature, and experiments have been done, and we can talk about it.
Yeah. Well, one of the points that you make in the earlier part of the book is that evolutionary theory is undergoing a change.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe this would be a good place to highlight some of these,
sure.
the changes that are happening. And again, the idea that these changes are pushing us towards the direction of teleology. And then we can, get into that whole discussion of, the agency, cognition, and teleology that there's an excellent chapter in your book where you describe some of the work that's happening there. But what are some of the changes that are happening in evolutionary theory that people may not be aware of, but really are reshaping the paradigm itself?
Right. Yeah. So the history is in 2016, which is not that long ago, less than 10 years ago. There was a very famous conference held by the Royal Society about evolution. And at that conference, a group of scientists, these are all biological scientists, some of them quite famous, brought up several new ideas in evolutionary theory, which included things like, included the idea of convergence, included the question of mutations. Are all mutations random? And it turns out, no, they're not. There are many cases where bacteria and other organisms will deliberately cause an increase in mutations at a specific time and even at a specific genomic location in order to overcome some stress. So, and that when it first came out in 1988, that was considered completely heretical and impossible and wrong. It's now been established. Susan Rosenberg is one of the best authors I can think of who's written reviews and many papers on this. And so the whole idea that all mutations are random, which was a mainstay of original neo-Darwinism, is gone. So most of them are, but some of them are not. So there is a mechanism by which organisms can decide to mutate
Yeah.
something.
Well, and I would even just add to that, and I again invite you to respond. But even this idea of non-random mutations, I mean, there are hotspots in the genome that
That's
are
right.
much more amenable to mutations than others. And
That's right.
all mutations aren't equal. Like transitions happen more readily. Sorry, yeah, transitions happen more readily than transversions. But
Right.
I've even seen articles where people are saying even the insertion points for retroviruses are not
Right.
random, that they
Right.
tend to favor certain sequences. And so, yeah, this is a far cry from this idea that things are just happening in a
All over
haphazard,
the right.
way, right?
So there were a couple of people, both very famous scientists, James Shapiro and Dennis Noble, who were talking about the idea that gene centrism is probably not completely accurate, that there are cases where the genes don't control what happens in the cell controls what happens in the genes. The cell has a lot of influence on, genetic events, such as, for example, transpositions, which you just mentioned. And there's something called niche construction, which is a fascinating area that describes, and the best example that people know about is beavers. Beavers make dams. Now, when a beaver makes a dam, it changes the environment. And the environment then has a different effect on natural selection and on evolution. So it's a two-way street. It's not just the environment which decides how various mutations will affect the organism. The organism can decide how to change the environment. And the beavers are the best known example, but there are many, many such examples. And so, and that's, by the way, very important in human evolution when we talk about things like, the origin of being able to drink milk in adults and other evolutionary things. So there are those areas, and there's several more which I'm probably forgetting, but all of this was assembled into something called the extended evolutionary synthesis, as opposed to the modern synthesis, which is the same as neo-Darwinism. And it was also called the third way. And this was originally met with quite a bit of skepticism. Many traditional evolutionary biologists said, yeah, all that stuff is true. Can't deny it because it's been published. But we already, that's just still part of evolutionary theory. And the response was, yeah, we know that. It's evolutionary theory has, expanded a bit. And I actually wrote a paper in, I think it was 2017 about that, about the extended evolutionary synthesis. And it was published in the Journal of the ASA, Proceedings in Science and Christian Faith. Perspectives of Science and Christian Faith. And I should say the ASA, which is the American Scientific Affiliation, which I belong to, is largely evolutionary creationist, although it doesn't take any particular stance. There are people all over the place, but that's the majority view. And so that was published there. But uh, a year later, I published a paper there called Teleology in Evolution. As far as I know, it might be the first paper to use that. It would not have gotten accepted in any other journal except the Christian one, and it didn't get great response. But as of last year, the ASA now has a working group called Teleology and Biological Evolution. So that shows you the progress over time. So so now at this point, where we have a revised a revised synthesis. We have this uh, you know new extended evolutionary synthesis that sort of forms the bedrock of evolutionary theory. But that's only the beginning, because science keeps moving. And once it started in that direction, oh, I should have mentioned epigenetics. That's another
Oh, yeah,
part.
right.
We now know that you know the expression of genes is controlled, yes, by other genes, but also can be controlled by other factors called epigenetic factors, and some of those are controlled by the environment. So it almost looks like it's going back to Lamarck, because some of these epigenetic marks, these effects of the environment, can be inherited. So the whole idea that if you as an adult experience something, by experience I mean it could be physical or whatever, that could be inherited. And we don't know how many generations, but it's more than one. And there's a great debate by Dennis Noble with Richard Dawkins, where Noble explains how this is going to be overturning the whole gene-centric view of evolutionary biology.
Well, I had a conversation. This is a bit of a rabbit trail here, but since you're bringing up epigenetics, I had a conversation with somebody, a biologist, who was becoming interested in the whole idea of quantum biology.
Mm-hmm.
And he was pointing out that when you have epigenetic modifications of DNA triggered by environmental effects, that actually can influence, which makes a lot of sense from a chemical perspective, the quantum tunneling between the proton that is shared by nucleobases, in DNA, which means that if I've seen studies, and when I was in grad school, we taking quantum chemistry, we did, a particle in the box calculation showing
Right.
that the spontaneous rate of mutation could be explained by kind of quantum tunneling between where that proton is shared differently between two bases, and that triggers a base pair mismatch and can
Right.
trigger a mutation. And so his argument was that if quantum tunneling is being influenced by epigenetic changes, that could actually be driving mutations at certain spots in the genome that then make the environmental effect become more permanent, or the environmental effect is actually triggering a genetic change. So it's going beyond this idea of randomness. Now, I don't know if this is how well established this is, but this is more kind of an armchair conversation. But there may be something with regard to epigenetics and quantum biology that even reinforce the idea that the environment is influencing the evolutionary process in a way that is highly Lamarckian, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's a great idea. I mean, quantum physics is heavily involved in photosynthesis, and we know that, and that's also moderately recent, that finding, but it's certainly true. The electrons don't just take one path; they try lots of different paths at once, and they go the best way. So yeah, there's so much fascinating stuff going on now in biology and molecular biology and biochemistry, et cetera. And some of it is, as you said, it's related to evolutionary ideas, and so that's why we need to be open.
Well, one of my favorite chapters in the book, maybe my favorite chapter, is the one where you talk about really what is the fundamental framework for understanding biology. And I go back to, again, my college days and the famous statement by what was the guy's name, the Russian.
Oh, I know what you mean.
But where nothing in biology.
Went out of my head too.
Yeah. Oh man, it happens as you get older.
It'll come during the talk.
Yeah. But Theodosius Dobzhansky.
Nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Right. And that was evolution's the organizing principle in biology, just like gravity or quantum mechanics and relativity are the organizing principles in physics. So to the point where if you don't embrace an evolutionary perspective, again, nothing in biology makes
Makes
any
sense.
kind of sense. It gives clarity to everything that we see in
Yeah.
biology. And that was the mantra that
Yeah.
I grew up with. And
Sure.
to even challenge evolution meant that you were not just simply challenging an idea, but that you were challenging the entire framework of modern science, or at least
Right.
modern life science.
Right.
How dare you? And so you have a very different perspective.
Yeah.
And when I read that chapter, it was like, wow, this is genius. It is so obvious, but I never recognized it myself until you articulate it. And it's like, of course. So tell us about your about that chapter and
Okay. Yeah.
your insights.
That's I think either my favorite or my second favorite chapter as well. It, you know, what you said is true. I mean, if and I often say this now. I looked up. Uh, I looked up biology in a number of universities, and just to use Harvard as one example, you cannot major in biology at Harvard. There's no such thing. There are two things you can major in: molecular biology, which is what we do, biochemistry and molecular, how molecular biology works. And the other one is evolutionary biology. And evolutionary biology includes everything else in biology: zoology, botany, you name it, ecology. Everything is called evolutionary biology. That's how important evolution is. And this change is not very old. It may have happened a decade ago. So what is that telling us? That's telling us that there is what you said is absolutely true. There is now a dogmatic belief that evolution is the basis, the basic fundamental underlying principle of biology. And it's the most important thing. But here's the thing: everyone agrees, including Richard Dawkins and Darwin, that the origin of life could not have come about through biological evolution, because you need to have um, life before you can get biological evolution. And why is that? Darwin knew, and he wrote in The Origin of Species, he wrote a phrase which is assume something like assuming a strong principle of inheritance. Because what makes life incredibly unique, by that I mean nothing else does it and all of life does it, is make accurate replications of itself. That's really the best definition of life. Now, people will say, "Oh, other things make copies of themselves." No, they don't. I looked that up, and this is highly cited in this chapter. I discuss all the things that people think make copies of themselves. Perfect copies, or almost perfect. Just to give you perspective, most living forms replicate themselves with 99.9999% accuracy. A tiny error, which is just enough to allow for evolution, but not nowhere near 90%. That won't work. And of course, other people have talked about this. Manfred Eigen has shown that with a high error rate, you don't get evolution, you don't get life. Well, I just did a very simple mathematical analysis where I looked at the math of evolution, and I inserted into it the accuracy, a measure of accuracy of replication. And there's a threshold, and it's pretty high. And if you go below that threshold, you get no evolution, which means you get no life. And so I published that in a mainstream journal in Biosystems. And I think that was in 2023 or four. So I decided, well, I have to put this in a chapter, because that's the fundamental underlying principle of biology. And by the way, if you do have this very high level of accurate self replication, evolution just occurs naturally. It's not even a law, it's just something that happens. It's a byproduct of the strong inheritance principle, which Darwin mentioned, and natural selection.
Yeah, and I think this is really profound, and I believe if people are interested, you and I had a conversation about the paper you published in Biosystems, because when you are looking at a requirement for that level of fidelity during the replication process, it's very hard to envision how the mechanisms of replication at a molecular scale are going to come into existence through an origin of life process, through some kind of chemical evolutionary bootstrap.
Not possible.
Right, which is, to jump forward a bit, you do have a chapter on the origin of life where I believe you take the position that the origin of life really does appear to be miraculous, in the sense,
Yes.
like the origin of the universe appears to be miraculous. Hopefully I'm not, misrepresenting your views, but part of that is, just this strict requirement for, high fidelity replication. Well, and I would just be curious how you would react to this. Again, a bit of a rabbit trail, and I apologize, but.
Well, no, I don't think it's a rabbit trail. I think it's very, very important. I think this is critical to my whole thesis. I think it's quite clear, and of course there are many people who agree with this, is that the origin of life is way beyond our understanding of chemistry and physics. And I don't think we're going to understand it through what's known in chemistry and physics. Your comment earlier about possibly a new law in physics, or a new law of chemistry, or perhaps a unique new law of biology might very well explain it. And I expect that will happen. People like James Tour, who of course shares my views on the origin of life, has often said that he thinks that science will eventually find it, but not by looking at what we know now. We're going to have to know a lot more. So that's all true in terms of the connection with self-replication. It's actually understood by almost everyone that you do need to have that. You need to have this self-replication mechanism, and what that self-replication mechanism is astonishing. And I have to say that in my own history, it wasn't until graduate school, and it's probably true for you too, Fuzz, in biochemistry, when I learned the details of protein synthesis. That's not taught on the undergraduate level. And, the incredible complexity of the ribosome, the messenger RNA, the transfer RNAs, the enzyme that puts the transfer RNA together with the correct amino acid, these things are amazing and couldn't possibly have arisen through any chemical process or any known process that we know of, including evolution, because it's required for evolution. So it's not just a gap. People have accused me of using God of the gaps. This is not a gap. This is a huge chasm that does not appear to be fillable currently. And again, I'm not saying that proves God. What I'm saying is that we will eventually find that God created some other law that we don't know about that explains it. So it does point to God in that sense.
Well, just a bunch of thoughts bouncing around in my mind. It's a lot of fun talking with you, Sy. Yeah. But, Michael Denton, in his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, brought up, I think, a problem that I think is very compelling, that is a companion problem to what you have identified as the high fidelity for replication, because he talks about the high fidelity needed for protein synthesis.
Yeah,
because
that's right.
Right, because otherwise you wind up in this death spiral if you don't have an extremely high level of accuracy in protein synthesis, because the ribosomes have a large number of protein components. I mean, the business part of the ribosome is a ribozyme, is an RNA molecule, but all those proteins are doing something. And if those are not made right, that means the next generation of ribosomes are going to be defective, meaning the next wave of protein synthesis is going to be even, has less fidelity, and you wind up in a death spiral. And so, you in a sense, you can't have DNA replication without having a means by which you're making proteins, because the proteins are playing a critical role in the replication process as well. So,
Absolutely, and that's right. It's almost a circle. But the the other thing, I have to admit that I tried to keep this book very non-technical, but there is this section. It gets a little more technical because I can't help it. I want people to see how amazing this system is, and of course, what I love to talk about is my favorite enzyme, which is amino acyl tRNA transferase. Sorry, synthetase.
yeah, I mean, who
And so,
doesn't love that enzyme?
oh,
Right?
it's an amazing enzyme. And one of the things the enzyme does, what the enzyme does is it puts the correct amino acid onto the correct tRNA. The correct tRNA has the anticodon for that amino acid. And that's already remarkable. But here's what's even more remarkable. If the wrong amino acid goes onto that tRNA, the enzyme, that same enzyme, has an editing system, a self correcting system, which destroys the wrong amino acid and says, sorry, you're wrong, go away. How that happens, we know, but it is complicated. But that's what happens. So it's a self correcting enzyme. Because of what you said, it has to be accurate. You can't put the wrong amino acid. Even you can't even substitute a glycine from an alanine, which is like one methane group different. You can't do that because the enzyme recognizes the wrong amino acids and destroys it. Wow.
Well, and I'm just curious because you may not have, and I wouldn't expect you to have read a book I wrote a number of years ago called Creating Life in the Lab. And in that book, I present what I today call the empirical argument for God's role in the origin of life. And part of my argument is, when you look at all the work that's been done over 70, 75 years in prebiotic chemistry, and I love hanging around origin of life researchers whenever I get a chance. They're just a different breed of scientists.
Oh yeah.
They're a lot of fun to talk
They're
with.
great.
The work that's been done in prebiotic chemistry is absolutely remarkable in that people have identified chemical pathways that, at least in principle, could contribute to chemical evolution. The problem is that all of this work is undermined by what you might call unwarranted researcher involvement. And Clement Reichert's, a German origin of life researcher, wrote a piece a perspectives piece that was published, I think, in Nature Communications.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Where he was arguing, look, this is a deep-seated problem, and I actually recognized and wrote about that about 10 years before Reichert's paper was published. But I pointed out that, look, this is a problem with every experiment that origin of life researchers do. You cannot escape the fact that origin of life researchers involve themselves, whether unwittingly in the process. They're contributing to the success of that chemistry, and you're never going to have origin of life researchers available on the early Earth to oversee things to make the reaction successful. And so I argue this is empirical evidence from 75 years of work that intelligent agency must be playing a role in the origin of life. And so everybody that I've shared this with who's done work in origin of life research agrees this is a problem, but they will not go to the theological conclusion. But I'm just curious, and you don't have to say nice things to me about this idea necessarily, but what is your take on that? As in a sense, the work is really not just simply, as you said, kind of a massive chasm, but there's actually positive reasons to think that there must be a creator, just based on analogy between what it takes for humans to do that kind of to make that kind of chemistry work.
Right. No, I completely agree, and this has also been brought up by the man I mentioned recently, just before, which is Jim Tour. He's talked about that a lot, also, and you're absolutely right. I think that this idea of having problems in the interpretation of what origin of life researchers do was recently brought up in a commentary in Nature by Nick Lane, who's another prominent origin of life researcher. And he pointed out a lot of the issues that are difficult to deal with, including the lack of negative data being published, which is very important because that's necessary to rule out certain things. And I actually just had a commentary on his commentary published in the new journal Biocosmos, where I mentioned, how great that is, and he brought up all these things. But then I added a lot of other things that were a problem that he didn't mention, and one of them includes what you just said, that this is, and the real proof of all this is the fact that, and see, I wouldn't even call it intelligence. Again, this is why I don't use the word intelligent design, because we can make every chemical that's needed for life. And most people are looking at how did RNA come about? How did you get proteins? How could you possibly get, a polymer of this type, membranes, all that? Well, we have all of that. We can take all of those. We have all of them. We can take organelles even, and various polymers, any RNA we want. We can put it all together, and we do not get life. So it's not, because we are intelligent. That's true, but we're not divine, and that's why I call this divine design, not intelligent design. Because if we assume that God created life, which is my assumption, one way or the other, either through some law that we don't know about, or just by an act of, bliss, an act of blissful creation. The question of how that was done is something beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our intelligence because we can't do it. No one's been able to do it. And it doesn't look like anyone ever will be, just based on what we know. So once again, we're faced with, okay, there has to be a science to it. There has to be a scientific answer. And I agree. But that scientific answer is going, if we ever find it, it's going to point directly to the divine creator.
Yeah, well, in my book, Fit for a Purpose, I hint at this, and I have done some follow-up blog articles where I think there may actually be an anthropic principle in prebiotic chemistry, where there very well could be the laws of physics constraining certain outcomes in such a way that what you see for living systems is predetermined in the laws of nature, and that if there's going to be chemistry happening on the early Earth, it's going to be driven in a very specific direction, which is
right.
What life looks like. And one of the people that really got me in thinking along these lines is the late Harold Morowitz, who wrote a couple of papers very quickly, in 2000, 2001, where he was saying that the components of the Krebs cycle, he was a metabolism first guy, that the components of the Krebs cycle seem to be these highly special molecules that would naturally form under the conditions of the early Earth inevitably. Right. And he thought that was really, really eerie, that the conditions of the Earth would conspire with carbon chemistry so that you're naturally going to get these intermediates that are part of the Krebs cycle. And since that time, there have been people who have done these experiments in prebiotic chemistry, where I think if you take pyruvate and glyoxylate and just throw them in water, a little bit of iron, they start to react and they produce successively the intermediates of the Krebs cycle, or some things that are very close chemical derivatives. It almost seems like now you're looking at, maybe there is a law, as you're mentioning, that is that very well could explain the origin of life, but it looks very much like a type of anthropic principle, to me at least, if indeed this is the direction that work in prebiotic chemistry is going.
Yeah. Well, I think that it might be time to say a little bit about the chapter 4, which is where I talk about agency.
Yes. Yeah,
Cognition.
we're way off on a rabbit trail, but yes. Yeah, but thanks for bringing us back, Sy. This is another very powerful chapter in the book. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, these are advances that are really suggesting there is a deep teleology to living systems.
Yeah.
And in that, again, we're moving beyond your grandfather's evolution.
You know, the idea that there's no purpose in biology became a dogma also. And my view is that that was because there's no purpose in the rest of science. Okay. In other words, nothing outside of life does anything for a reason. It just responds to physical and chemical forces surrounding it. What I like to say is that no volcano ever erupted because it felt like it. You know, there were pressures that built up and erupted. And that's true for everything that's not alive. It's not true for anything that is alive. So, you know, plants and animals do things for a purpose. You know, an animal hunts because it's hungry, a rabbit runs away because it doesn't want to die, etc. There's always a purpose for everything we do. So the idea to try to take away purpose out of biology has always been insane. I think it was done because some early biologists were afraid that if we use purpose, it's not going to be scientific because there's no purpose anywhere else. Well, that was a mistake because purpose is clearly there. It's also present in all of life. It's present in tiny, bacteria. It's present in single cells. They move. They do things for a reason. And what's very related to teleology is agency, the ability to do something. So you may have the purpose to live, but if you can't move, if you can't run, you're going to get eaten. Okay, so you have to have that agency. You have to be able not depend on the outside world, not depend on other forces, but a living organism has to be able to say to itself, either consciously or unconsciously, I better get out of here, or I better go chase that animal, or I have to do something. And then they are able to do it for that purpose. So we are now finding that this exists all throughout life. And by we, I mean the modern scientific community. And there have been some, and this book that I held up before has many examples of it. Evolution on Purpose. There's some great articles in here. And one of the things that is shown is that included in that purpose is the idea of an end goal, which is actual teleology. Michael Levin, who's I think one of the pioneers in this world, has shown that during the development of certain creatures, I forgot what they were, but worms are some simple creatures. As they're developing, they have to build, channels like blood vessels, things that kind of thing, and they have to be a specific diameter in order to work well. But if you fool around with that embryo in such a way that it doesn't go do the normal process, it can't do the normal process, it adjusts. The animal adjusts its processes so that you end up with the exact correct diameter of that tubule. Now, how does that happen? Because we think of biology as there's a set of processes that occur, biochemical processes that lead to one thing. And if you disrupt it, it doesn't happen. It breaks. It doesn't work, right? No, not always. This animal is able to, it knows its goal. It seems like it knows what the goal is. The goal is to have a tubule just this wide, no, not narrower, not wider. And it is able to adapt as it's developing to put out that exact, and there's so many other examples like this. The other part that is absolutely astonishing is this idea of cognition. And here is a wonderful review, which I cite by Pamela Lyon. I recommend it to anyone, Lyon. She talks about cognition in bacteria, and it's astounding. Bacteria, and I'll give you just two examples if I can. Uh, One is there are bacteria that can put out either a toxin in case they're threatened by something else, or they can put out a flash of light if it's needed. But they can only do very little. So a single cell putting out a flash of light does nothing, or putting out a few molecules of toxin does nothing. But when they're all together and they all at the same time put out this toxin or this flash of light, you can actually see the light, and the toxin will kill anything around it. And how do they know they're all together? They put out signals, and they get the signals and they say, "Oh, I'm not alone. My friends are here. Great. Let's coordinate and let's all do this at the same time." And they do. These are bacteria. An even more remarkable example is another kind of bacteria which is able to change its metabolism if the oxygen level goes down. And they are able to switch the metabolism that can now survive on lower oxygen levels. So if you put them in the lab and you lower the oxygen, after a few minutes, you see them changing their metabolism. But now, instead of doing that, you raise the temperature a little bit. Then you lower the oxygen. Now, if you do that a few times, the bacteria learn that raising the temperature comes right before lowering the oxygen, and they will change their metabolism before the oxygen is lowered because they have learned that higher temperature means lower oxygen is coming. It's just like Pavlov's dogs, but these are bacteria. They have no brains, they have no neurons, but they have learned something that affects them. We don't know how that happens. The last I've read, there's some fibers that congregate in one part of the cell that maybe have some of that, can store this information in some way, but it's not known. So what I'm saying is that all of these characteristics of advanced animal life are true throughout all the plant kingdom and all the single cell prokaryotic kingdom as well. It's all of life. And how did that get there? We don't know. But I think, as you said earlier, that when we look at the amazing reality of living creatures, we see a divine hand. And you mentioned that I say that life is a miracle. And yes, I start out one of these chapters by saying life should not exist. There's no reason for life to exist. It's crazy. And yet here we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's almost as if, with respect to what you're describing in bacteria, that there are these algorithms somehow that are mysteriously controlling the
Yeah.
operation of these bacteria, right? That there's there seems to be an algorithmic undergirding to even the
Yeah.
simplest system.
That's a good point.
Well, a couple more questions here. We've been going long, but this has just been, for me, a lot of fun to have the conversation with you. You do have two chapters. We've talked about the origin of life, where you talk about the miracle of life's origin and the miracle of humanity. And I think it's interesting because the two areas that I've focused on in my time as a Christian apologist have been the origin of life and the fundamental design of living systems, and the idea of human exceptionalism and human
Right.
nature. And so talk a little bit about what's in the chapter where you address the whole question of human nature and specifically the origin of consciousness.
Yeah. So I talked about human nature even in my first book, the works of his hands, and I have a passage where I say things. It starts out with what other animal, and then I go through all the things that humans do that no other animal can come close to. Uh, and 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 I've always been a human exceptionalist. Even when I was an atheist, I knew that humans were different, really special and different. Um, and I didn't know why. And of course, I still don't know why, except I believe that God is the creator of humanity. And that's where I think evolution kind of stops. Now, evolution may explain our bodies. I mean, we're probably hominids and whatever from the ape family, but that's our bodies. That's not us. And we are clearly more than our bodies. And whenever I say this, I'm usually online and I'm saying, here's an example. The two of us are talking. How many apes get online and talk to each other? So, that's obvious. That's clear. But the real question about humans, I think what you said, is consciousness. And what is that? Where does it come from? I make the case that consciousness could not have evolved. First of all, it's not favorable to survival. Being conscious does not help you, survive very well. You can. There are plenty of animals without the kind of human consciousness we have who can hunt better than us, who can, mate more than us, who can do everything that counts in evolution better than we can. And what I like to point out is if there were two tribes of hominins, one was conscious and one wasn't, or one had a much lower consciousness and we have what we have, the one who had the lower would probably do better because you're not going to have anyone in that tribe saying, gee, I don't feel like going hunting today. I'm in a bad mood. I mean, our consciousness doesn't really, evolution doesn't help to explain it.
Or I'm not going to go hunting today. I think I'm going to paint something on the wall of this cave.
Yeah, there you go. I'd rather paint the hunt instead of do the hunt. That doesn't help you eat. So, and the other part of it is a lot of interesting science, which includes some work by Roger Penrose, who I think is probably the greatest living living physicist right now. The man's a genius, and he is not a Christian or a theist in any way, but he has come to the conclusion that consciousness is not computable, and he got there by in a process that I find difficult to understand because I'm not that smart, which is the famous equation of sorry, oh boy, that went out of my head too. The principle of well, we'll skip it. I don't want to waste time. But he has come to that conclusion through analysis of this principle of non-computability. And what does that mean? If consciousness is not computable, it means we're not going to be able to explain it using any kind of mathematical or logical system. And in fact, I think the problem of consciousness, which is called the hard problem, right, is so difficult that somebody like Daniel Dennett, who is a brilliant philosopher, but also an atheist who is very strongly committed to atheism, has written a book saying it doesn't exist. It's not real. It's an illusion. And okay, if you want to believe that consciousness is an illusion, and you also, I mean, Sam Harris, the other one, the other atheist who's very smart, wrote a book called "There's No Free Will." I mean, and to deny the reality of free will and the reality of consciousness in humanity, to me, is an example of atheism denying science because of their own religious beliefs. And I see this. And I have to mention this too, because I think you'll appreciate it. There are many atheists these days, I don't know if you run into them, who claim that the genetic code is not really a code.
Yes. Oh, that drives me nuts.
It drives me nuts. And by the way, Richard Dawkins drives him nuts too, because he's a biologist. No biologist believes this. This is a purely atheistic meme. And what it tells me is they're denying the existence of an actual code, because there's no question that the genetic code is a code. They're denying that because they can't explain it without some miraculous event, because codes need a coder. And who could have made the genetic code if there was no one around to do it? So I've just mentioned 3 examples of science denialism by modern atheists. And to me, that is a strong sign that when it comes to reality and truth, Atheism is falling behind.
Yeah, well, and again, I'm prone to taking us down rabbit trails, but it's not just simply even with the genetic code that it requires a coder, but it's an exquisitely optimized code. It
Yeah.
displays
Oh, yeah.
multidimensional optimization,
That's
so
right.
which is mind boggling in and of itself. You know, you have a final chapter in the book where your point is that eventually you think, and I would agree with you, that there are going to be these laws of biology that will emerge. And your contention is that when that happens, we really are in a position to say, to make a very strong, unequivocal case that life is ultimately the handiwork of a creator, that there is divine design. So maybe
Yeah.
hopefully I've not misrepresented your point, but go ahead and just maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, yeah, there isn't that much I can say because this is all speculative. Most of this book is not speculative at all. I have a huge amount of citations. I think over 300 in the book, and the reason for that is because a lot of what I'm saying, a lot of people will read that and say, "What? That can't be right." So that's why I have the citations, because it's there. It is. That's where it's published. This chapter is not like that. This chapter is more speculative because what I'm saying in this chapter is, you pretty much summarized it. I'm saying that we we don't know anything about what will happen in science in the future. I mean, go back to 1873 and tell people that the speed of light is a constant because time slows down. They'll think you're nuts. Or tell them that a proton, a particle can be, a wave and electron both. They just say you're crazy. Nobody can predict these things, and we can't predict what's going to happen. Um, Based in my faith that science will always find answers to things. I think there will be an answer, but just like a lot of other scientific findings, including aspects of quantum physics and including what we know about biology, uh, there are pointers to God in all of these things. The fine tuning of the cosmological constants is a pointer to God. There isn't any other good explanation for that. And okay, if sometimes an explanation comes up for these things, but that explanation does point to a creator. And I think that's what will happen. Now, I can't be any more definitive than that because I have no idea. It might be some of the things along the lines that you've talked about, an anthropic principle that comes out from some prebiotic chemistry. I don't know. But at this point, what we do know about life is getting more and more amazing and miraculous as we go. It's not getting less so because you would think that if the answer to all of this was pure materialism, we would be heading in that direction. We would be coming up with very clear mechanisms for everything. And it's just the opposite that's happening. We're finding that there are no clear materialistic mechanisms that we can point to explain human consciousness, to explain origin of life in general, and how evolution works. We need to have something that's new, and who knows what that is. So I end it with saying something like, somebody will come up with that, and that will be a beautiful beginning.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Well, and it just makes the whole science faith enterprise a lot of fun to just think about what could actually happen. What is it that we're going to discover? And, instead of being afraid of scientific advance, really Christians ought to be reveling in scientific advance, particularly given, as you're pointing out, the trend line that we're seeing in all the different disciplines, but particularly in the life sciences. It's an exciting time to be alive, and I can't wait to see what happens next. Well,
Amen.
Sy, I so much appreciate all the time that you spent with us. This has been, to me, a lot of fun to have this conversation with you. And you're one of my favorite biochemists. and
Let me just interrupt you for a second, Fuzz. I just remembered the name of that principle.
oh, good.
It's Gödel's theorem.
Okay.
Godel.
Yes. Well, good. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No. I'm just saying that it's just a pleasure to be able to, to have this conversation with you. And I'm glad that there's so much that we can agree upon, and so much that we can be genuinely excited about together, even in the midst of maybe seeing a few things a little bit differently. But what's remarkable to me, and this was part of what I wanted to accomplish with Fit for a Purpose, is I think what's emerging is increasingly a bridge between the old Earth creationist position and evolutionary creation. And maybe we're going to wind up standing on different parts of the bridge, but we're going to be very close to each other. And that to me is really, really, quite exciting, that there is that convergence that's happening. But I really appreciate your time. And I would just encourage people that are watching this to get a copy of Beyond Evolution, whether you agree, with Sy or not. This is an incredibly provocative book. It's going to challenge. Thank you for holding that up. It's going to really challenge, I think, you, if you're open-minded, to maybe think about evolution a little bit differently, with a little bit, maybe, if you or somebody like me who's wants to keep evolution at a distance, maybe you're going to be less prone to do that. But it's also going to highlight to you just how remarkable the advances that are happening in the life sciences in general and in evolutionary theory, where things are again becoming increasingly teleological. And that's something that we can all celebrate. The idea of materialism, as you pointed out, Sy, is waning and waning rapidly. So anyway, thanks again for being with us.
Oh, I enjoyed it. It's always great, Buzz. See you next time.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who has watched this podcast or listened to it. We very much appreciate your viewership and your listenership. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this interview. If you don't mind going into the comment section, let us know what you think. We want to hear your discussion about this whole question. Can God use evolution to create? And where is evolutionary theory going? Also, make sure that you remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, use the notification button so that you're alerted when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops, which is every Wednesday, a new episode drops. And you can watch those episodes on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. And then last but not least, share this program with a friend. And remember that the more we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.